Hey gang, I'm Jordan David, and if you're new here, trust me, we're both surprised. Sit back, relax, enjoy the video. Today we're going to be talking about the book Lycurgus, specifically the 4 things that King Lycurgus of Sparta does to change his society from a greedy, envy-filled, luxurious place where individuals are fighting each other to a completely conformed totalitarian regime. We're going to talk about the positives of that, we're going to talk about the negatives of that, and how it might apply to you. But before we get started, go ahead and tap that like button on the back. He gets really lonely sometimes. So this story is written by Greek philosopher Plutarch. He was actually a Greek biographer, but what you get in these books is a way of life presented by different people in Greek history that you're supposed to glean lessons from. And so Lycurgus, by happenstance, becomes the king of Sparta. And Sparta is an oligarch at the time, ruled by 1 king or 2 kings, and Lycurgus is very beloved, so he gets called to come to Sparta and become king. But before that, he was traveling the world and studying other governments, including that of Crete, Ionia, and Egypt. And he's trying to figure out what's the best way to govern a nation. And he comes back, and all of a sudden, Sparta becomes his guinea pig. Now, why would you want to change Sparta from an oligarch to a totalitarian regime where people have absolutely no freedoms? Well, you could argue it one of 2 ways. Either Lycurgus has a need for power and control and just wants to subjugate the Spartans under his rule, or you could argue that he sees a better way in this community lifestyle that he implements and actually wants the best for Sparta. So I'll talk about the 4 main ways that he changes Sparta, and then we'll see what the outcomes are to see if his supposedly altruistic goals for making Sparta a totalitarian regime turn out the way that he wants. Plutarch talks about 2 dichotomies that Lycurgus would like to expunge from Spartan society, and those are envy and arrogance, crime and luxury. So when you have luxury, you have people who have less than luxury, and that instigates crime, or so Lycurgus believes. When you have arrogant people, you have people who are envious of what those arrogant people have. So, how do you get rid of these really big abstract concepts from a society? Well, you can't control how people act, but you can control what people have. So, Lycurgus uses a 4-step plan to equalize what everybody has in Spartan society so that he can get rid of arrogance and by association, envy, and he can get rid of luxury and by association, crime. The first thing that Lycurgus notices when he's trying to change Sparta's makeup is the massive inequality of land ownership. Noting that, say 20% of men own 80% of land, and a lot of people are destitute because they can't grow food on land because they don't own it. So they're stuck paying whatever prices these rich men, charge them. And so Lycurgus goes to them and either convinces them or forces them to relegate their land ownership to the government. And then he redistributes it into parcels for every citizen, such that every head of a household, every man, gets 82 bushels of land, basically. So that land is able to produce 82 bushels of grain, which is enough to feed the family for a year and then some. After that first change, Sparta no longer has a property inequity problem, but Lycurgus looks around and still notices a fairly large wealth gap, a huge inequality over what the richest have versus what the poorest have. Lycurgus didn't feel like he could just take the possessions and money that people had acquired and redistribute them because it would require affecting a much larger part of the population. With the landholding dispute, 20% of people were angry at him, but he got 80% of the land out of it. So 80% of people who got more land were happy with him. However, to completely balance out wealth inequality, he would have to take from the richest 50% and give to the poorest 50%. which is fine, except that 50% of people are now already mad at you because you took things away from them. It's a numbers game, so Lycurgus decides that there's a better, more sneaky way to get wealth to not matter in society without directly taking and redistributing it. And this plan is ingenious. Now, back before the days of fiat currency, it was all about how much of a metal that you had determined how much it was worth. So $1 worth of gold would be heavier than 1 cent's worth of gold. It didn't matter what it looked like, it was about how much it weighed. Gold and silver were precious back then as they were now, and iron was abundant back then just like it is now. And what Lycurgus does is he bans gold and silver as currencies of Sparta and makes iron the official currency of Sparta. So merchants come with tons of iron and take all of the gold and silver that Spartans have, and then they leave. And what you see is because iron is not rare and gold and silver is, the people who had more gold and silver got more iron. And this iron's pretty much useless. You're getting a shit ton of iron for a little bit of gold, and you can't carry it around in your pockets, can't spend it. What are you gonna do? Put a cube of iron in your closet? So the money now becomes really inconvenient. Having more money is taking up more space and having less utility. And the people who have a moderate or small amount of money don't see much change. The secondary outcome of this is that once foreign merchants had grabbed up all of the silver and gold, and all of the rich people had houses full of useless iron, the foreign merchants stopped coming because they didn't have any reason to sell goods or clothing to a society that had no precious money to offer them. They just had the iron, and the merchants certainly didn't need iron. They could have gotten that at home. So they stopped coming. What that means for Sparta is now money really has no value because you are growing your own food on your 82 bushels worth of land, and you have to make your own goods because nobody is selling you goods. And this completely devalues money because what do you need to buy if you have food and you have possessions? Now, the third change Lycurgus made is said to be his most controversial and actually led to a group of men running down the street attempting to stone him, but he narrowly escapes. Lycurgus sees that with wealth inequality and property inequality neutralized, the biggest issue that Spartans face is an inequality of food. So they can all grow the same amount of food, but people who have all of this excess iron could buy the excess food from other farms and have more food, become more fat, or they could hire somebody to make better food. And this experience of eating, which is also near and dear to us, is unequal, and Lycurgus wants no inequality. So what does he do? He has people give their crops and whatever they grow on their land to the government, and the government opens up these dining halls, and everybody is required to eat meals publicly, not a choice. They all must come and eat in community together at these long dining tables, rich and poor, high status, low status people, and they're all served the exact same food in the exact same amount, and they're all sitting at the exact same tables. And the outcome of this is that now not only do the rich and poor have no, wealth gap separating them, but they have no societal gap separating them because they're eating the same things, sitting at the same table. So how is one really different from the other? The fourth and final change is all of the little bits and pieces that are left over that Lycurgus notices. This includes clothing, building of new houses, and idleness and time, because they're all self-sufficient. So they can build things as fancy or as plain as they like. They can make clothes as fancy or as plain as they like. And if somebody's making fancy clothes and somebody's making plain clothes, envy still exists and arrogance still exists. So he institutes strict codes about house building, about how they're able to sand things. They're not allowed to carve designs into their wood. All the houses basically look the same. Clothing, say goodbye. He enlisted the men to service so that they weren't idle and made them drill around naked. And the kids had to grow up naked too, so the entire society had no clothes. Nobody had more than anybody else. So what was the outcome of these four big changes, right? Were they good? Were they bad? Well, These 4 changes are what transformed Sparta from any other Greek city-state, like the ones surrounding them, into this superpower, this military superpower of crazy people running around naked and eating at community tables. This change is the reason that you've heard of Sparta by now, because it gave them such a reputation as these self-reliant, fierce warriors who could do and can do anything. And not only that, but they would die for any one of their number. Because when you're sitting at a table naked, eating the same exact food as the person across from you, it doesn't matter where they come from, what they had, you see them in you and you see you in them. And there's this incredible sense of community in Sparta and this fierce nationalism that they're willing to do anything to keep their way of life the way that Lycurgus made it. And they did for, I think, like 1,000 years. Sparta existed and was incredibly famous amongst Greek city-states because of these changes. There was no Gallup poll for citizen life, and you might say, well, hey, this is a totalitarian regime. Sure, they didn't have to worry about what they were going to eat. They didn't have to worry about where they were going to sleep. They didn't have to worry about any of the basic necessities of life. But they didn't have any rights. They didn't have any freedom. They didn't have the ability to get something more than what they had. They just had to be content. Is that really a life that I want to promote? Is that really a life that we would like to live? Well, it seems very, against the American idea of living, which is more akin to like playing the lottery. You try to be Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, but the odds of that are actually worse than the Powerball, because 1 in 330 million is smaller than 1 in 292 million. But we wake up every day and chase money so that we can have a house over our head and we can eat the food that we would like to eat and we can pursue the things that we want to do regardless of what our neighbor wants, regardless of, our relationship with other people. It's a very individualist dream. That's fine, but you do sacrifice this sense of community. You do sacrifice this self-sufficiency, and in some regards, you sacrifice this toughness that the Spartans were able to cultivate. I mean, Sparta was not a cakewalk, right? Plutarch actually writes in here that the men were drilled so hard and, forced to be out warm, cold, rain, or sun, military training, so that they would have absolutely no free time because that created luxury, that when they actually went to war, it was a lot easier than being at home. And they became, the only nation that ever had a happier time, an easier time at war than they did in peacetime. And so I think that is telling about the day-to-day experience of Sparta. Maybe it wasn't the most rewarding for the individual, but at the cost of the individual was the benefit of the whole. Nobody had a large societal worry because everybody took care of themselves and they took care of one another, and there was never any threat to that. And we might not be drilling, naked in the streets, but despite all of the immense wealth that exists in America, a large amount of people still report that they're unhappy, and a large amount of people in America still report that they feel like they have no social mobility. And if you get rid of the idea of social mobility, then that's one less concern that people have. And this is, Lycurgus' argument against idleness. If you have all this time to sit around and think about how you would like a better life for yourself, then you are completely tanking the betterment of the whole, and you're never going to get it because you're always chasing something more than you have. And just for fun, let's do a little example. The richest period in American life is arguably 1949 to 1969, coming off the heels of the Second World War, when average median household income rose by 99.3%, so it nearly doubled. And that's adjusted for inflation and everything. This boom of American wealth is often attributed to the economic policies of World War II that dragged America out of the Great Depression and into this, superpower state. And what are those economic policies? Well, The government suspended free market capitalism and assigned specific industries to specific companies so that supply chains would be smoother, and that instead of competing within America for each other's business, we were competing against external forces to strengthen America as a whole. And then once we were out of that, the capitalist policies returned and allowed us to use all of this momentum that we got into building this exponential amount of growth. So, what's the answer? Is it socialism or capitalism, totalitarian regime or libertarianism? I have to say, as I always do, that it's probably in the balance. I think that it's about knowing when to sacrifice individual freedoms and knowing about when not to conform, and then learning the wisdom to know when to use each of them. And this is very hard to implement on a large scale, and I don't expect to see changes made tomorrow, and I don't expect the right changes to be made ever. But we keep ping-ponging back and forth as a society towards one radical idea to the next radical idea, and it seems increasingly we're less willing to try both and see the outcome. And I think that that might really benefit us in the way that Lycurgus' changes benefited Sparta. Those are my thoughts on the whole matter. Lycurgus is free online, so I've linked it in the description below. If you're looking to get into any kind of Greek philosophy or biography, this is a great resource. It's so short and it's so digestible. There's no fancy words or anything. And it just, I mean, it's a beautiful little biography by Plutarch of one of the greatest ancient Greek societies. So go ahead and check it out. Also, subscribe to the channel while you're at it and like the video. Leave a comment below discussing what you think of the balance of totalitarianism and libertarianism in American politics and in ancient Greek politics, and I'll be sure to respond. Thank you so much for watching, and cheers.